We're following the latest on the historic talks between North and South Korea. Diplomats from both countries met for the first time in over 2 years overnight.
The North agreed to send athletes to next month's Winter Olympics in South Korea. Officials are also expected to lay the groundwork for possible talks on North Korea's nuclear weapons program.
For more on this, we want to bring in Alex Kliment. He's a writer for G0 Media's Signal newsletter. He's also a CBSN contributor and part of a new partnership between CBS News and G0 Media, which is a Eurasia Group company. Alex, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So we know these talks between North and South Korea are mainly focused on the Olympics, but could this lead to perhaps negotiations over Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program?
Well, look, I think the first thing to say is that it's unquestionably a good thing that the North and South are talking at all, right? I mean, anytime nuclear war is hangs in the balance, you want people talking, right? Potentially rather than tweeting, I would say. And so I think that's a good thing. Considering the history here as well, right? The last time there was an Olympics in South Korea, North Korea didn't attend and they bombed a commercial airliner in the run-up to the games, right? So this is unquestionably a good thing from the perspective of North-South relations. What it doesn't quite answer, though, is the problem of what to do about North Korea's nuclear program. And there, I think it's a much more difficult road. The reality is that Kim Jong-un views the development of a nuclear weapon that can reliably hit the continental United States as an existential security question. He wants and needs that more than anything, right? If this guy has refrigerator magnets, there are two pictures on his refrigerator, Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, right? As reminders of what happens if you don't have nuclear weapons and you're at odds with the United States, or if you give up your nuclear weapons, as Gaddafi did, and it ended badly for him, right? It's not clear that any amount of economic enticement or pressure can deter Kim from that aim, right? And that's a big problem, right? The Trump administration has actually done a pretty good job, beneath the bluster on Twitter, they've actually done a very good job of rallying a UN sanctions regime against the North. The Chinese have gone along increasingly, the Russians have gone along, because they don't want to see a nuclear crisis on the peninsula. But there's still no evidence, really, that Kim is willing to respond to that pressure by saying, okay, guys, I cry uncle, I'll come to the table and let's talk.
You know, the president has certainly been criticized for the way he talks to Kim Jong-un and tweets at him, little rocket man, comparing the size of nuclear buttons. But Rex Tillerson and the president both say, hey, this right here, what we're seeing, these talks, this is proof that our strategy is working. Could that be true?
Yeah, I mean, look, these talks came about because in his New Year's Day address, Kim Jong-un said, in addition to reminding the world that he has a nuclear button on his desk and all these things, he also said, hey, look, by the way, I'm willing to talk to South Korea, right? Now, why? The sanctions are obviously squeezing him at some level. I think what he wants most, though, is a period of thaw in which he can get to the next level of nuclear weapons that he wants, right? He's still trying to develop better and better weapons. He doesn't have a missile that can reliably hit the continental United States, right? He says he does, no one's really sure. He needs to conduct what's called a horizontal test in order to prove that. So he, wants a little breathing room from the sanctions, maybe, but what he really wants is more time to get what he really wants, which is that missile that can hit the United States. And it was an opportune moment because he knows that President Moon in South Korea was elected in part on a pledge to ease tensions with the North. He also knows that President Moon wants to make sure that the Olympics go off without a hitch, right? A North Korean nuclear test counts as a hitch during the Olympics.
Big time.
And so he took advantage of that timing, say, hey, let's talk. Maybe he can drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States. But I think his fundamental aim, which is to develop that nuclear capacity as a deterrent against a U.S. attack, remains unchanged, and it's very difficult to get above his threshold for pain on that.
I wondered if part of this was him having a certain comfort level with where the nuclear program is, that he felt that he had perhaps a negotiating wiggle room because, as many have reported, much of the world was caught off guard by how advanced the nuclear program in North Korea had become.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that he has wiggle room, it's hard to say.
Right.
But I think what's clear is that his ultimate goal is that deterrent, right? The question of how Trump's Twitter policy, let's call it that, has impacted things. Look, I think it's a fair question whether the threats that he's made, which really were just in a more kind of raw form, the underlying logic that's always been behind nuclear deterrence, right? I mean, for 70 years, the idea was that the U.S. had a bigger nuclear button than anyone else, except for the Soviets, right? It's just that Trump is saying it in a new and sort of coarse way. Yeah. But there's a fair question whether kind of bringing that sort of threat to the table has made the Chinese and the Russians say, hey, we better work a little harder to rein this in. I mean, I think that's a fair question. But I think the underlying issue is that what is it that's going to make Kim Jong-un change his calculation? Right? He looks at what happened to Gaddafi, looks at what happened to Hussein, looks at what happened
doesn't want regime change.
Doesn't want regime change. Looks at what happened with the Iran nuclear deal, right? Which was very difficult to arrive at, and now Trump is sort of walking that back, right? So from his perspective, what economic enticement or punishment could push him to give up his weapons? Very hard to see. This is an isolated and repressive and backward regime that is willing to continue being all three of those things.
Let's talk about the perception of the United States as a moral authority, a world moral authority. The president has taken a hardline stance on North Korea. That's always been the case. But it seems as if there are other leaders that are stepping in to fill that vacuum, as the president, as stated through his own policy initiatives, has looking to make an America First agenda a big part of his administration. Other world leaders are sort of stepping into that stage, including France's President Emmanuel Macron. You write about that in the Signal newsletter. So
Macron is currently on a state visit to China, and when he arrived in China earlier this week, he tweeted in French, "I am here to tell you that Europe is back." Right, which was an interesting thing for him to say. He didn't say, France is here, France is back. He said Europe is back. What Macron is trying to do is to lay claim to leadership of a new and more energetic European foreign policy, and I think he's taking advantage of three things at once in order to do that. First, Brexit is removing a perennial foreign policy heavyweight from Europe. Right, it's galvanizing more continental cooperation. The fact that Germany is wrapped up with an inward focus, trying to form a government, takes Germany kind of out of the global picture for the time being. And of course, as you mentioned, Vlad, the America First foreign policy deliberately kind of narrows the U.S. role in the world. It says the U.S. role is not to lead multilateral initiatives, is not to be a sort of moral authority all over the world. It's to be a much more narrow sort of transactional approach, which leaves a vacuum for other leaders, right? China is going to try to fill that role, certainly, but the Europeans are also angling as well. And Macron wants to be the guy who is kind of leading that charge on behalf of Europe.
Looking forward, I mean, does it make sense that the United States takes this America First approach? We've always had, going back to the end of World War II, that we are going to be, not only are we the world superpower, but we also have a very significant voice when it comes to what's happening in world affairs. Now the president is saying, look, we need to focus on the issues that we are faced with here in the U.S. These other leaders are stepping in. It sounds all great that Macron is doing it, but when you have China, perhaps even Russia, looking to exert their spheres of influence, what does that mean for us? Not in an election cycle, which is, I think, how this country tends to look at things, but I'm talking about 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Yeah, I think, we're heading towards a much more, what's called multipolar world order, right? I mean, as you say, for 70 years there, the United States was the kind of preeminent global superpower, right? Rallying, creating multilateral institutions, rallying to causes, doing these things. And the Trump foreign policy, questions the wisdom of that, right? Whether you like it or not, it's just a different approach. It says, actually, the U.S. interest is not to do all of these things globally. It's to focus more narrowly on a certain kind of transactional interest. Is this directly benefiting the United States or not, right? Whether they have a good strategy for doing that is a different question, but it's certainly a different view, and that creates space for other actors. I think it's also important to say that it's not, this is the trend of the U.S. kind of having less influence is not just a Trump question, right? This has been going on for 15 years, right? I think the overreach of the Bush foreign policy contributed to some of that, arguably the underreach of the Obama foreign policy, the rise of other economic powers in the world, not the least of which is China, but also Russia's making a play for more global authority. So there was this background in which U.S. influence was kind of already in decline. The Trump administration has made a big kind of break by saying, look, we actually are going to pursue a different philosophy entirely, and that leads to a much more kind of fragmented and multipolar world.
And I don't mean to suggest that, I mean, the analogy to what's happened 70 years ago, 75 years, 80 years ago is perhaps not applicable in the times that we're living in today.
Sure.
But at the end of World War I, the United States also took an America first approach and became increasingly isolationist, and that directly, in some instances, some recountings of history, led to World War II. General Marshall then said, look, we really need to be involved in what's going on around the world so that we prevent what we saw in 1940. What's your take on that? Is there an analogy to be drawn from history or no?
Look, I mean, anytime you have a larger number of contestants for regional power or for global power, the risk of conflict goes up, right? If you have one power that is sort of an organizing power for the world, that can decrease conflict in some places, but also there can be a backlash against that, right? There are plenty of people who weren't so happy about U.S. power for all of those years, right? Because there's a question of whether a superpower uses its power judiciously in all cases, right? I mean, you talk to a lot of people in Latin America, a lot of people in the Middle East, they would raise a question about that.
There's an argument that was also an America First policy, right? Because obviously America's not going to make any decisions contrary to its best interest.
I mean, there's no one sort of good or bad way. There's sort of different ways that it plays out. But I think that the point that you underline, the point that you raise, it really is this: is that when you have a world in which more powers are pursuing their interests in a more sort of narrowly nationalistic way, the risk of conflict certainly goes up.
Let's talk about technology, staying on the theme of technology, and discuss President Trump's tweet. You have a write-up in today's Signal that highlights his tweets and what he's focused on most since taking office, based on his tweets. What did you find out? What did you find out?
Well, so I think, look, his Twitter feed provides really an unprecedented window into the daily thinking, usually early morning thinking, of a U.S. president, right? I mean, love it or hate it, it is a direct window into what he's thinking at really at all times. So we ran there's an archive online of his tweets, which you can search by word or theme, and we ran through some of his favorite kind of themes to hit on. And fake news comes out like way ahead of all the other things. I mean, he is concerned.
Hence the fake news awards,
which are coming up on Wednesday.
Yes, I've got my popcorn ready.
Yes,
cannot wait.
I'm sure you do. So fake news is a big topic for him. Russia is a big topic for him, not surprisingly. He had a big spurt in Iran tweets last week, of course, but in general, it's been much less of an issue for him than Russia. Kofefi, he tweeted twice. Let us not forget. And I think Sloppy Steve Bannon has come in at 3 tweets at the moment.
Not Stable Genius is not in there
Stable Genius. Well, that was 1 tweet. So Sloppy Steve has gotten himself 3 tweets at this junction, but that could rise later this year, of course. So
that's very cool. Well, it's great having you here. We love the newsletter.
It's
so
great
informative.
to be with you.
Alex Kliment, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.